This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, welcome to Undistracted. I'm your host, Laura Bennett, and this is the podcast where we learn from our guests how to be better at building our lives with intention around our passions, our purpose, and deal with some of the stuff that gets in the way of that. Illness can be complex. It's different for all of us who face it. Jamila Risvi and her friend Rosie Waterland wrote the book Broken Brains as a companion for anyone facing illness, family and friends trying to support a loved one through it, but also to look at why we distinguish between physical illness and mental illness and how sometimes that leaves a lot of people unnecessarily isolated. Let's welcome Jamila Risvi to the show. What is it about your brain that you would consider to be broken?
Well, it's actually a term that my son came up with when he was much younger. He was 2 when I got diagnosed with a rare kind of brain tumour called a craniopharyngioma. And when we tried to explain to my son what was going on, we tried to use terms that he would understand. And at that age, broken's about the worst thing that can happen to you, right? Like when you break something, when a kid falls over, you go, "Is it broken?" And they go, "No." And you're like, "Well, you're okay." And so we were trying to explain to him that it was really serious, but also when something's broken, it can usually be fixed.
So what was the steps then? When you get a diagnosis like that, what was the next thing on your mind that you were going to need to do?
I don't know, honestly, if I had anything on my mind because I didn't have any sense of what was happening or what was going to happen. I was really very much in the hands of doctors, but also didn't really question anything. Like, a few people said to me, did you go and meet with a bunch of neurosurgeons? And I was like, no, I don't think I was thinking very straight, to be honest. I was doing rather than thinking. But I was diagnosed in a somewhat circular kind of route. So I had a very diligent GP that had picked up something was not quite right with my body, but the way my brain tumour presented itself was in the form of a missed period. And so she sent me off to see a gynecologist and an endocrinologist, and it was through a brain scan with their instruction that we picked it up. And so the first person that I really talked to about it was my gynecologist at the time, who was, very kind and gave me as much knowledge as she had, but it wasn't her area of expertise. So the next step was to wait to see a neurosurgeon.
Yeah, it kind of seems like the wrong part of the body to be getting the information about a brain tumour from. But yet, I guess that's sort of the way that some conditions work. Like symptoms present in other parts of our body, which makes the whole situation that much more confusing.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's the brain, right? Like it's in charge of everything. It's in charge of how everything in our body works and what's happening. And so literally anything can be the result of something going on in your brain because your brain's telling the rest of your body what to do. And in my case, the tumour that I had was cutting off the blood supply to my pituitary gland. Your pituitary gland is a little pea-sized gland that sits at the base of the brain. And because that blood supply was getting cut off, it was affecting my hormones.
Wow. Do you think that's normal? When you mentioned that, you weren't really thinking, you just sort of followed, the advice of the doctors. Do you think that's normal when any of us get a medical diagnosis to just kind of ride it out a little bit in that way?
I suspect it is for people for whom it comes as a shock and haven't had experience with the medical system in much of a way before. I had been in hospital twice before all of this. One was to have my wisdom teeth out, and I wasn't really in hospital for very long. It was about an hour, and once was to have a baby. So I just didn't really have much experience of being unwell. I was incredibly fortunate in that way. And so for me, I really did feel, as someone with quite a lot of respect for authority as well, I really felt guided by the system, and I sort of just did what I was told without questioning too much.
Do you think that's been a good thing, or would you do it differently now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I ended up, by a sort of some peculiar circumstance and a friend's recommendation, ultimately going with a different neurosurgeon to the first one I was recommended to. And my neurosurgeon has done the most incredible job. And so any version of history or events where I am not treated by him would be a scary one to my mind. I do wish I'd asked some more questions, I think, about life beyond surgery and what surgery would mean. And I think this is quite common for a lot of people, that you're so focused on the big event, right? Like on when it's neurosurgery, you're focused on the fact someone's going to cut open your skull. And quite reasonably, that is what you are thinking about, and not really much else. You don't think about, well, what will life look like afterwards? You think about, like, is it going to hurt me? How long am I going to feel sick for? And, am I going to survive? And questions like that. But in my case, at least, I didn't think, like, what's my life going to look like in 12 months' time? I wasn't looking that far ahead.
So what were some of the things you found then on the other side of surgery? And as I understand it in the book, I mean, you've had to have multiple different surgeries. What's been on the other side of those that you weren't foreseeing?
Well, I suppose the correct terminology is brain injury, not because any of my doctors did anything wrong. In fact, they were an impeccable team. But after my first surgery was very successful in removing a whole bunch of the tumour, but not all of it, because there was bits of that tumour that were adhered to pretty critical structures in the brain and just couldn't be safely removed. And so it just kept regrowing after that for a couple of years, and I had to keep having different interventions. And as a result of some of those where surgeons had to be more aggressive and radiotherapy had to be quite aggressive, that started to do damage to my brain and impact some of the ways that my brain functions. So in that way, life changed forever, really.
Is there a point when you're going through sickness? I mean, in your case, yes, it relates to brain surgery, but obviously sickness is a word that people will apply in very different ways to whatever their situation may be. But is there a time where you feel a sense of, like, you're not yourself anymore? Like, is there a point where it feels like your own identity is not quite what it was pre-sickness?
Yeah, I think so. I think illness does shift your perception of yourself, particularly when it happens when you're younger. I mean, I was 31 when I was diagnosed. I had a 2-year-old son. I was not at the time of life where I had friends, or friends' partners who were going through something similar. I very much felt like the first and the only one. It was a really lonely sort of experience for me, and that was, I think, part of what made it so challenging, that I really didn't feel like anyone else got it and didn't feel like anyone else knew what I was going through. And of course, there were lots of people who would have. They just weren't my contemporaries. They weren't my mates. And I do remember there being a period of time where I felt like I had much more in common with some of my parents' friends than I did with my own, because, I go out to coffee with my mum and her mates, and they might be talking about various health challenges, and I'd be like, yeah. And I really felt like, I'm more similar to them. None of my friends are talking about these experiences.
Has it made you more empathetic?
It feels like such a weird humble brag to say that, but I do. I mean, maybe I was starting from a really low base. Who knows? But I do think it has. And in fact, one of my really good friends, Claire Bowditch, said to me the day I was diagnosed, she came over that afternoon and she said to me, "You don't know it, but this is going to change you for the better, and you are going to survive it, and empathy is going to be your new superpower. You don't know how much this is going to change you for the better." And I remember thinking at the time, she's bonkers, and not really taking it in. But I look back on that and, I think it is true, because, we all experience vulnerability of different kinds at different points in our lives, but physical vulnerability on average tends to happen when we're a little bit older. Not to everyone, but on average it tends to be something that's associated with your body aging, right? And for me, it means that it happened much earlier. And even now, only sort of 7 years on, I think I am a better friend. I think I'm a better sister. I think I'm a better mum, because I've had that experience of that intense vulnerability and fear, and I know what that looks like and feels like, and I've got some better tools perhaps to be able to support other people through it.
Those assumptions that we make about illness, about sickness, that it does only happen to the older people, to people with some kind of predisposition, even in some circumstances, do you think that inhibits our ability to deal with illness and sickness effectively across our lives?
Yeah, I do. I think in the same way, and again, I'm generalising here, but in the same way most younger people don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about death, I think most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about illness or disability and how that might impact them personally. You might be thinking about someone else that you care for or love, but you don't necessarily think about what might happen to you, certainly not in an enormous amount of depth. You know, you might see tragedy on the news and think, oh my gosh, imagine if that was me, imagine if that was my family. But your imagination doesn't go to the extent of what that actually looks like and feels like and how it would change a person's life in great detail. You know, it's not pleasant to think about it. It's upsetting and can be distressing to think about it. But I actually think I have benefited from having spent a bit more time reckoning with my own mortality and my own physical vulnerabilities. I do think it's made me a more well-adjusted person, and I think it does make you better able to cope with difficult moments in your life.
How do you think it's affected your husband, Jeremy, your son as well? Like, they're alongside you in this journey. How has it played out in their lives, do you think, to see you going through something like this, but also to deal with, you know, the emotional ups and downs of what a diagnosis and everything that comes after it really means?
Yeah. My husband, you know, like I joke now that he was worth marrying just for the first few weeks after being diagnosed. He was absolutely extraordinary. He kept me upright, and he was the person that sort of stepped me through everything. He carted me off to a psychologist the day after I was diagnosed to make sure that I had support from the very first day. He had this, I don't know if he had it, actually, that's not fair, but I know he certainly showed me just this absolute confidence that I was going to be okay. Like when I was scared and panicky, he just would not entertain anything other than the prospect that I was going to be fine. And I think his confidence really helped grow mine. And I felt safer as a result, even though what he was doing wasn't based on anything other than wanting to make me feel okay. I think he made me feel like it was going to be all right. And I suspect that took a real toll on him because it's a different kind of challenge, right? Like the challenge for the person who is unwell and, you know, dangerously unwell is to imagine what their future might look like and how it might change, but also to imagine the prospect of what it would mean for their loved ones to be living without them. Like that's what you're thinking, you know, they're the sorts of thoughts that you're going through. Whereas the partner of someone sick has a different kind of challenge, but an enormous challenge all the same, because their thinking has to go beyond the worst possible outcome. And they have to think about, well, what would they do afterwards and how would they cope and what would that look like? So I think that's an enormous pressure because essentially that was endured very privately from the person that my husband deserved the most support from, which is me, because I couldn't be the person to provide that support because I probably wasn't in a good enough headspace to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's a strange dynamic.
My son was really a strange dynamic because you're going through something similar but also very different. Your different vantage points make it a really different experience. And there's a lot of imagining and empathy being asked of partners because in the end, you know, my partner watched it the whole time. My husband was watching this from the moment of the diagnosis to today and watching it up close at home and to be honest, watching parts of illness that I don't remember because I was out of it and, you know, had all the lovely medical drugs to mean that I don't remember it, but he does. So it is a different experience, but it's a traumatic one all the same, and that can't not have an impact on people. And then my son was very young at the time, so he doesn't remember much now, but you spoke about empathy earlier. Look, every parent thinks their kid's the most extraordinary kid. Mine actually is. He is one of the kindest people I've ever met, and I really do think that's got quite a bit to do with what happened when he was very young. I think he has learnt kindness from day one, and he has learnt what a lot of 2-year-olds don't learn, which is he had to learn for someone else to come first in the house. Because normally it's the 2-year-old that comes first because you can't avoid that. But he was very young when there was a period of time where, you know, you've got to be careful with mum and you can't be too noisy because mum's sleeping, and you've got to be cautious because mum's got a drip in her arm, or you've got to be careful because mum's head's got staples in it. You know, he had to learn to put someone else first from a very early age, and he's a remarkable human being.
Wow. What a beautiful, beautiful family. And I think too, as you say, like there's a shaping that kind of happens and a responsibility as well, particularly on Jeremy, to carry this idea that everything's going to be okay and to be the one that sort of stays hopeful. Like almost in a lot of situations, the family aren't allowed, or the friends that are supporting, they're not really allowed to have a breakdown because it's not going to be helpful to you if they're suddenly going, you're not going to make it, this could go wrong, that could go wrong. Like if they were to truly express emotion like that, that's quite a lot for the person who's unwell to carry as well.
Yeah, I think you are entirely correct. They've got to be, or at least project to you, that full confidence. And there's this great concept that we talk about in the book called ring theory, which is it's sort of a series of concentric circles. And in the middle of the very centre circle is the person who is unwell, or the person who is grieving, or the person who something awful has happened to. So in my case, this is me in the centre circle, and then Jeremy and Rafi are on the next ring out, and then, you know, my parents, my sister are on the ring out after that, and then my closest friends, and you keep going out to your colleagues and your neighbours and people you have less of an interaction with. And the idea of ring theory is that support goes in from the outside circles in, and your own grief or your own coping strategies and the people that you fall apart to, that has to go out. So I think for Jeremy, it was an enormous amount of time where he could fall apart to other people, but he couldn't do it to me. And that was the right thing. And I think it was part of what meant that I got through it all. But that's a big ask, because the reason you get married in the first place, right, is because not only do you love one another, but you expect that person is going to be the one who helps you through your hardest time. And I wasn't much help to him through his hardest time because I was focused on staying alive.
And it is interesting. It's normally when we say like in sickness and in health, we're probably thinking more about the health side and not necessarily sickness, which in your case, as you say, like you're 7 years down the road now. What does it look like for you to currently have, I'm not even going to try to attempt to pronounce the type of brain tumour, but to have that particular condition, how does that affect your life now?
Yeah, so I have a craniopharyngioma, which I had to learn to pronounce and spell when I first got diagnosed. That was the first challenge. So for me, I live with the brain injuries of the attempts to remove it, and that is challenging. I won't go into all of the details of the things in my brain that don't work properly, but the big one is that my brain doesn't produce cortisol anymore, and cortisol gets a bad rap these days. It's talked about a lot in diet culture and fitness and things, but cortisol is the stress hormone, and it is produced when you experience stress. And so if you able to experience less stress or minimize stress in your life, you make less of it, but you always make a baseline amount. And in my case, I don't make it at all anymore. And without cortisol, you can't be alive. And so I'm lucky enough to live in 2025 where they can give me it in a tablet form. But one of the challenges I have day to day is I have to guess at the amount of stress I am under, physical stress, emotional stress, to decide whether or not I need to take more of it. And it's a steroid, so it's not good for you to take heaps and heaps of it. So you can't just go, I take heaps every day and then I don't need to worry. But it is a unusual experience, and something that it really has taken me 5 or 6 years to adjust to, this idea that hour by hour I have to sort of be aware of physical or emotional stress on my body and how that might impact me. And that's just one of the many things that my brain can't do anymore. And
in deciding how much stress do I want to swallow in today, to literally add stress into your life.
Yeah, how much am I going to need to cope with? Yeah. I remember grandfather passed away about 5 years ago now, and as soon as I heard the news, I took some extra cortisol for the next couple of days, and I had to fly up to Sydney for his funeral, and so I took some extra cortisol those couple of days because I thought, a lot of flights plus, the emotion. And then I went back to normal. And 2 days afterwards, I ended up in hospital because for whatever reason, my brain and body, maybe I was just running on adrenaline, but I was okay. I coped. I think I was so focused on supporting my mum and getting through a really difficult period and supporting the people around me and making sure funeral was organised and everyone was ready for what was coming next, that my grief hit a couple of days afterwards.
Wow.
And who would have known? I remember feeling like I did everything right, but you can't schedule grief. That's not how it works.
It's a constant learning lesson. And I think what I really appreciated too about Broken Brains, and something that you and your co-writer, Rosie Waterland, what you're doing, is highlighting the distinction between sickness and illness that is very physical, that you can have that brain scan, you can show on a piece of paper exactly what's going on. But in Rosie's situation, she carries varying degrees of trauma and PTSD that present much more in the form of mental illness and anxiety and sort of sickness in that kind of context. What do you think is the key difference, when a sickness is visible versus something that is real but kind of intangible in some way? How does that affect the way that we're treated in regards to our sickness?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that my partner Jeremy took me to see a psychologist the day after the diagnosis, because he thankfully was knowledgeable and aware enough that he knew I was going to need additional support and tools to get through the period that was ahead of me. And but goodness, he was right. I'm so glad I had that support. But if it hadn't been for him, the first medical person who asked me whether or not I was receiving any support for my mental ill health was a doctor about 2 years later.
Wow.
And, I would think I don't think it was just me. I think anyone who is diagnosed with a brain tumour could use some support. Maybe it would just be short term, maybe it would need to be long term, but I suspect anyone would need some support in those circumstances. And yet it sort of wasn't assumed as part of the process. And, that speaks to some of the complexity of how our medical system works and is funded and how doctors are trained. I know, for example, that had I been diagnosed with breast cancer rather than a brain tumour, that the support would have looked very different, because of some of the incredible work that's been done by breast cancer awareness and research charities in this country. There is enormous care through the McGrath Foundation and others that is around psychological, emotional and administrative support through illness. But some illnesses are better funded than others. And I have a rare disease, and it might seem like, well, fair enough. If you've got a rare condition, well, that's kind of how things go. We can't fund them. But if you add all of us with rare conditions up together, I think we end up being about 40% of people who are in hospital. So there's a lot of us with rare conditions, because there's lots of those conditions. And I think that psychological component, Rosie and I went into this book in writing Broken Brains. We wanted to make the point that as a community, we take physical ill health far more seriously than we do mental ill health, and we respond to it and we support the people in our lives far better when they're physically unwell rather than mentally unwell. And I think what we found by the end of the book was that even making the point of difference between physical ill health and mental ill health, it was sort of a false binary. It's illness happens in the body, and in my case happens in the brain. And it doesn't matter what kind it is. It's all interlinked. I don't think there's anyone who becomes seriously physically unwell who doesn't experience some impact on their mental well-being. And I don't think there's anyone who experiences mental ill health who doesn't have some physical symptoms or physical side effects. Because when we're anxious, when we're depressed, it shows up in our body, not just in our brain. It has an impact on, we feel a tightness in our chest, or we feel a pounding, or we feel sick in our stomach, or we have aching limbs, whatever it might be. All of these are physical manifestations of mental ill health as well as physical ill health. And so the distinction's sort of a false one.
And there's also a real distinction between the way that, your family and friends supported you, Rosie's family and friends. I mean, our networks are all going to, of course, be quite unique, but where you were getting like lasagnas and, people coming and knocking on the door, checking you're okay, Rosie sort of didn't have that, which makes the situation that much more isolating, which in the situation where you've got, mental ill health, anxiety and et cetera, the isolation's not really going to be a real help to that at all. No. And I think, it doesn't matter what kind of hard times you're going through. There's very few people who would say, oh, it was easier because I was on my own. We're human beings, and we seek solace and support from one another. But I think lots of people feel uncomfortable around illness, and I certainly had a handful of friends who I
think just didn't know what to say and didn't know what to do. So they just didn't do or say anything because that felt safer. There's almost this perception of, if I say or do something, I might make it worse. Like when you've just been told you've got a brain tumour, nothing some friend says is going to make it worse.
No.
Like it's already bad. But the presence of friends can make it feel less lonely. And I think when it comes to mental ill health, it's the majority of people who stay away, and it's the majority of people who don't know what to do. And one of the things we've tried to do with Broken Brains is explore what helps and what can help and what can be helpful and what is worth saying and how to show up for people, knowing that it's going to be different for every person in terms of what they need. For example, every time Rosie's unwell these days, I always make sure to send her food because I've definitely learned that she doesn't get the lasagnas that I get when I'm unwell. So I try and make sure she's well fed.
Yeah, it's a really good way to be a great friend, I think. And Broken Brains is truly, it's a great read. It's a insightful read. Is there something, would you say you wrote it for the people going through sickness, for the people around them? Like, what's your hope for those that pick it up and read it?
Yeah, thank you. It's both. I've spoken about feeling lonely when I was unwell, and I did go searching. I went searching for people who had been through something similar and would speak about it in a way that I felt was honest and that would sort of bring me into a feeling of like, oh yeah, me too. Or like I've also experienced that. But I found that people tended to speak about illness either from a place of having gone through it and having survived and being triumphant at the other end of it, or we would speak about the illness of people who very sadly didn't survive. And I still feel like I'm in it. And I tried to write as much of this book as possible. Parts of it were written when I was in hospital. I tried to write from what it's like when you're still in it, because I remember when I was unwell looking at the stories of the people who were triumphantly on the other side, sort of thinking, yeah, good, but how do I get there? So very much written for people who are experiencing ill health of either kind. And I would hope that it would make people feel seen and feel comforted and less alone. But equally, I think it's a book to help people understand, because I've had so many friends and family who very generously said, help me understand what it's like so I can try and help.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Undistracted. You can rate, review it, share it with a friend, maybe that person you know who needs a little bit of support through whatever illness they might be facing. You can let me know what you think. Email undistracted@hope1032.com.au or find me on Instagram @laura.bennett_. Until next time, enjoy living this undistracted life.